the Qur'an very much looks at the role of motherhood as an indication of the majesty of the divine. We could also add here that the word rahma, or mercy, is one of the names of Rahman, is the compassionate, the merciful. It's the most common name that's at the title of different chapters of the Qur'an, talking to God, or referring to God as Al-Rahman and Al-Rahim. And the Rahim, like Hebrew, it's a Hebrew cognate, is also the word for womb. So there's a linguistic congruence between these beautiful names of God that reoccur so frequently, and the function of the womb in nurturing a child. So here, for those of you who are keen on once again looking at the Arabic, there it is, for the idea of human beings being created from this one soul and from the abdomens of mothers. Now, one of the tropes that I find that's kind of misinterpreted about the Qur'an is that only men are going to receive some type of like heavenly virginal beings in paradise. And so if we look at what the Qur'an says very, very closely, it has verses of no soul, no person knows what is hidden for them, in plural, in terms of these pleasures of the eyes, or things that ease the eye being as one of the seats of emotion. So we find, actually, when we look at the Qur'an, that there's many references to immortal youth in general, which are in the masculine plural sense, meaning gender inclusive. We do find references to Qur'an. Interestingly, in most of Islamic art, these are usually depicted as female figures, but if we just look at the words themselves and not look at the words through a male imaginary, we see that Qur'an it's actually not gendered at all. It doesn't really have. It just means wide, rounded-eyed beings. So these are just some of the ways. So I've been asked in chaplaincy context by women, why is the Qur'an promising virgins to men, and what about the women? Right? And it's a matter of actually sort of reading what the Qur'an has, and maybe not looking as much to the folklore that has surrounded the Qur'an. Another way in which I see that there's a deep egalitarian trend that runs through the Qur'an is in this story, which I'm sure you can infer by the image what story this might be referring to. So the original pair, Adam and Hawa. Hawa, by the way, I pulled this out of an Arabic dictionary. The root, Hava in Hebrew, but Hawa, this root in Arabic means to gather, collect, unite, encompass, embrace, contain, hold. What a beautiful name for a female progenitor. Adam, I'm told, in the Arabic language is a type of soil as well. So you have this idea of the earthly, and then this female presence that holds what is the breath of God. The breath of God breathes into each individual, and that's the divine spark. So the womb nourishes this breath of God into a living being. But when this couple, who you'll recognize, makes a mistake in the garden, the Qur'an actually does not specifically blame the affair on Eve, not in any way. And in fact, when the couple speak to God, they speak together. So they have this phrase, which is so very important to Muslims, because this is the formula for tawbah, for tshuva in a Hebrew context, for returning. And this is the formula, in essence, for maintaining oneself on the straight path to, yes, we're going to err, that's part of our human nature, but we do this perpetual act of returning to God. And this very powerful prayer formula in the Qur'an is said in the grammatical dual, on the tongue of both Adam and Eve together. And it's a detail that can so very easily get overlooked. And these verses were read on the first night of Ramadan in mosques as part of their usual recitation of the Qur'an, and I just wonder how many people were able to catch the significance that the male and female progenitors together said this secret prayer formula. Other places, I'm taking you through some of the egalitarian tropes because people are often curious about them and ask about them, and I'll get to our lessons for contemporary times in a minute here. But I wanted to show you how Sarah, and we have the Arabic for Sarah, is both given the good news from the angelic presence right along with Abraham. I'm assuming though you're familiar with the rough contours of the story because it does come, it has a parallel in the Hebrew Bible tradition. So we see in the Qur'an, you see these are the verse numbers here. So in one telling of the story in the Qur'an, the perspective is more on Ibrahim, alayhi salam, peace be upon him, receiving the news. And then the other telling of the story is, this first telling here is about Sarah, and then the second telling of the Qur'an is about Abraham's reception. So we see that the perspective of both couples is actually represented, but you have to go to two different places in the Qur'an to get the different views, the different views of the story. But both receive glad tidings. And what I enjoy pointing out is when we put the stories side by side, Ibrahim receives the news from the angels, and then we look at the exact semantics of the verse. It says, then we, God, gave her glad tidings of Isaac, and after Isaac, of Yaqub. So there's even an immediacy in there, but certainly it might have been through the angels. That makes sense that it would have been through the angels. But just the fact that it's in the language, it is totally unmediated. It's just a beautiful affirmation of her connection to the divine. In the story of Musa, those of you who know the Hebrew Bible tradition will know very closely the Qur'an tradition because it parallels. We see that though we have a male figure who's the protagonist of the Exodus story, the male figure doesn't get to be the protagonist until he's saved 4 or 5 times by different women in a sequence of events. I'm working on a piece now with a few other authors for the Journal of Feminist Studies and Religion, elevating the significance of the female figures in this particular story. So even though it is true, if you look at the Qur'an, many of the stories have a prophetic protagonist that is a man, there is definitely a role of all of these women. And I discovered in my research that there's not one prophet in the Qur'an that is not mentioned at least in conjunction with family in some instance. So I wanted to maybe go a little bit faster here, but there's a verse that talks about the mother of Moses being inspired by God, using the same word that means revelation. There's lots of ways in which the women figures. So now that we've gotten a sense of some of the biblical figures, how they appear in the Qur'an, some of the ways in which I find the Qur'an to be deeply egalitarian in its approach, I wanted to slide us into the second part, which is about the stories for our contemporary times. And it was very appropriate when I walked into the Jewish Center this morning for Shabbat that the theme was sacrifice, because it's so much a core to, I think, Abrahamic religions and sacrifice, the sacrifice story, right? It's so very central. But we can also think that there's a parallel female version of this when the mother of Moses, and this was a story that was preached at the mosque on Friday afternoon, so it was so very appropriate. She receives this message to throw her child into the river, right? Because this child is, because of the political circumstances, under threat. Now this is a type of kind of hear and obey moment as well, just like we could say the sacrifice was a hear and obey type of moment. I mean, you're throwing a child in the river, you're pretty much giving them up for most likely felicitous outcomes. So there's a way, I think, if we think about sacrifice and we think about the stories of both the Hebrew Bible and the Christian Bible, of course, including the Hebrew Bible, and the Qur'an here, we can also think about kind of the mother of Moses as one of those hear and obey type figures. Interestingly, let me say one more thing about this for our lives today. It's oftentimes I've tried to find ways to relate to the theme of sacrifice in a world in which we really no longer make sacrifices. We make them as Muslims in a particular holiday at the end of Eid al-Adha, which marks the end of the pilgrimage season, which commemorates Abraham and his family and their lives. But I wonder if you've heard this preached in Christian context, right? What are the sacrifices that we make on our daily basis to bring forward our faith lives, or to bring forward the political causes that we care about? So I think that theme of sacrifice can really resonate, and especially in Ramadan, we're giving up food and drink and other potential daytime activities. And so it's in a society, in an age where we're often just given all these messages about comfort and feeding one's ego and being kind of having something as soon as one wants it. How can this trope, this reoccurring trope of sacrifice, what can that continue to be alive in our society today, and what can that do to kind of our collective polity? In the story of Moses, there's one very significant detail between the Hebrew Bible story and the way the Qur'an tells the story, and that is that the Qur'an has a very central role for the wife of Pharaoh, who in the Qur'an is a resilient woman who is married to a tyrant who is as abusive in the home as he is in the political sphere. And so her prayer in the Qur'an is a very poignant one. It's the last verse of the Qur'an in female speech that occurs. It's one of the last verses of the Qur'an in one of the last chapters to be revealed, so it has a kind of almost a capstone effect in some ways. And she says, this is the wife of Pharaoh, she says, my Lord, Rabbi, I say Rabbi so you hear the Hebrew, those of you who might know Rab from Hebrew context. So, my Lord, build for me, near you, a house in paradise. And this, to me, if we're going to take the lesson in the contemporary times, of course, she's asking for a house because she's not safe in the house that she occupies, even though it's a palace. But what does that say to us contemporary peoples? Oftentimes we're so focused on our material circumstances in the here and now, right? And here's a person, because of her circumstances, she has all the material wealth one could want, but she's focused on proximity to the divine. So I think for people who come to life with a spiritual aim, it's really, to what extent are we focused on maybe the ultimate cause of being proximate relationship to the divine, whether in this life or as many of our traditions hold in a next type of existence. The other difference in the story of Moses that I think would interest those of you who are more familiar with Hebrew Bible stories is this encounter where Moses finds his eventual wife at a watering hole. I don't think this is not in the biblical tradition that I know of. There's so much midrash, it could be in a midrashic tradition. But essentially after Moses flees, because he's accidentally killed a person in Egypt, he's wandering through the desert, he makes this beautiful prayer, and he says essentially, my Lord, I am poor, and so I'm in need of whatever help that you would give me. And it turns out that the very next thing that happens is that he meets these women in a watering hole who can't get their flock watered because all of the other herds people are gathering around the water hole and not giving them passage. So Moses, being the big surly guy that he is, pushes through, gets their flock watered, and is is kind of content for doing his duty of the day after having just kind of fled his existence in the palace in Egypt, and so from this story, it brings up questions about how we live our lives, right? We're so busy in our own crisis moments and the like, and here we have a figure in Moses, and he does this good deed for these women, helps them get the flock watered. But in case we think it's one of these princess stories of women getting rescued by Moses, it turns out they then do the rescuing, because one of the girls says to her father, "Oh, father, hire him. Surely the best you can hire is the strong and the trustworthy." And the words here, qawi in Arabic, this word right here, I believe it might also have a Hebrew cognate, but this word can mean both like physical strength, but it can also mean fortitude. And so it has that double meaning here. Iman, which means belief, comes from the same word that means trust. So when we say mu'min, which is like a believer in Islam, it has that dual significance of someone who has faith, but also someone who has trust, or even who, so here we see this cognate, someone who is trustworthy. So it turns out that Moses does end up taking this offer for employment, and the father says, "I will employ you on the condition that you marry one of my daughters." And so when I teach this story, as I sometimes do in halaqah settings, in Muslim study circles, I use this as a story for how a female figure negotiates marriage, and very subtly just tells her dad, "By the way, Dad, he's strong and trustworthy," right? And you can kind of read between the lines. Is she interested in her father's business or something else, right? So it's just a way to say that the Qur'an sometimes gives us gives us stories that we can read into and have a good time reading into, but also derive lessons from. And this is, I think, right here, a lesson in how to be proactive in getting what one wants, but in a Muslim context, I teach this through how to work with other people to kind of, how to work through the family system. And oftentimes, because we are in such an individualistic culture, there can be an impulse to not go through the family. I basically told my parents that I was getting married and that I hope they like the person, so I'm a little bit of a hypocrite to saying this, but that is the way I teach it in Islamic context. Another figure in the Qur'an is a figure in the biblical tradition as well, although her story in the Qur'an is fleshed out in an entirely new dimension in the Qur'an, involving demons, involving magic, involving magnificent thrones being transported in the blink of an eye from the kingdom of Sheba to all the way up to Jerusalem. So it is an absolutely fantastic story in the Qur'an. If you're not familiar with it, it's been taken in allegorical ways. It's been really the impetus for a lot of creative thinking in Islam. But what I wanted to point out here is this female sovereign that's represented in the Qur'an in a very, very positive light, and she ends up taking her whole community sort of into the fold of Islam, which is a good thing to do if you're a Muslim, right? So she's a heroine of the Qur'an, and she's the only Quranic woman who's not related to a prophetic family or the like. She's a queen in charge of her people. They're very reverent towards her. And she's a very successful diplomat. So when I teach kind of how to be, when I teach Quranic kind of diplomacy, she's the first person who comes to mind. And I think this so wonderfully reflects our circumstances today, where sometimes you see it takes a shift of perspective to break the edge on some of these political conflicts, these ongoing political conflicts that we have. And sometimes it's through the activism of women. I love that the Qur'an, when it depicts a diplomatic figure that is a woman figure. Now I want to shift just a little bit into the New Testament context to indulge you all with a little bit of the stories in the Qur'an that come out of that context. The Qur'an is oftentimes talking about households and being God chose Adam and Noah, and the house of Ibrahim, and the house of Imran. Do there have any guesses from the room who is in the house of Imran? Any guesses other than the people who obviously would know? So, the house of Imran is never a figure who's specifically in the Qur'an, but the mother of Mary is in fact the wife of Imran in the Qur'an. So we have this matrilineal house that goes from Jesus' grandmother, I like to say, the mother of Mary, and then to Jesus, to Isa, who, although being a male, comes into the world just in an Islamic context as well as a Christian one through this miraculous birth. So, when Mary's mother is mentioned in the Qur'an, she dedicates this child in her womb to the service of God, and she says, "Truly you are hearing and knowing." Now this is lovely. A lot of figures talk about God in the Qur'an with these names, these divine names. But what I wanted to draw your attention to is this verse right here has just been preceded by this verse in which the narrator of the Qur'an, who Muslims understand to be the voice of God, it says, God is hearing and knowing. And then it jumps right away to this woman figure who is in prayer, devoting Mary, who she doesn't necessarily know the gender identity of at this point, to the service of God. And she says, "Truly you are the hearing and knowing." So she's we could say, a theologian right there, a woman theologian, understanding the nature of God, having this intimacy, and calling upon God in the exact same words as the reference itself. So right there you see the hearing and the knowing. So for me it's an emphatic recognition in the Qur'an of women's spiritual intimacy, and it's not like someone taught her those words, they just came out of her prayerful, intimate moment. Now there's a neat thing about the Qur'an that I noticed as I was going through, and those verses in the Qur'an that talk about Adam dwelling with the mate in paradise, and Satan makes them both stumble and says, "Get down, you, an enemy to the other," meaning Satan and humankind, not meaning man and woman. On the